Hello. Before we begin, a quick note. The Boy to Sleep podcast relies on you and sponsors, which means you will hear a quick advertisement before the beginning of tonight's episode. While the podcast is free, you are welcome to subscribe for just $2.99 per month, which supports the creation of this podcast and gives you an ad-free listening experience. Simply click the link in the show notes from your podcast app. Rest easy.
Take your plans out of the group chat and get long weekend ready in new Abercrombie. From day to night, pack new outfits for every part of your itinerary. Grabbing brunch? Throw on the A&F Mila dress. Then head to your dinner reservation in their new bubble hem mini dress. And yes, permission to overpack for pics with the girls. Abercrombie's best-selling Scarlet Squirt deserves a post in your feed. Your plans are worth it. Shop Abercrombie's new long weekend collection online or in store.
Hello. Welcome to the Bore You to Sleep podcast. The podcast that will hopefully help you get to sleep. I am going to read an open source book, one that is not particularly interesting, but one that is hopefully boring enough to get you to sleep. Tonight's reading comes from The Moon and Sixpence, written by William Somerset Maugham and published in 1919. This story follows one man's journey to follow his dream to become an artist. My name is Teddy, and I aim to help people everywhere get a good night's rest. Sleep is so important, and my mission is to help you get the rest you need. The podcast is designed to play in the background while you slowly fall asleep. For those who are new to the podcast or may not know, I started this podcast due to my own struggles with sleep. I wanted to create a resource for others facing similar challenges, and I'm so grateful for the amazing community we have built together. The podcast is self-made and self-produced, which is why you hear a short ad at the beginning of each episode. These ads, along with support from subscribers and patrons, enable me to keep delivering this podcast for free to those who need it. Thank you to everyone who shared their words of gratitude with me during the week, whether through the website or your podcast app. Your messages mean the world to me. My goal is to keep this podcast free and accessible to everyone. Support from listeners via Patreon and Spotify also plays a crucial role. If you find the podcast beneficial and would like to support it, here are a few ways you can contribute. Follow the podcast in your podcast app and leave a comment. Become a subscriber for $2.99 per month. This also removes ads at the beginning of the episode and supports episode creation. If subscribing is not possible, an easy way to help is simply by leaving a review and rating in your podcast app. Even one sentence really helps out. If you would ever like to say hello to me, you can do so at boytosleep.com. If you would like to share the podcast with someone you know who needs a good night's rest, that would also be an amazing compliment. In the meantime, lie back, relax, and enjoy the readings. The Moon and Sixpence by William Somerset Maugham. Chapter 1. I confess that when I first made acquaintance with Charles Strickland, I never for a moment discerned that there was in him anything out of the ordinary. Yet now few will be found to deny his greatness. I do not speak of that greatness which is achieved by the fortunate politician or the successful soldier. That is a quality which belongs to the place he occupies, rather than to the man, and a change of circumstances reduces it to very discrete proportions. The Prime Minister out of office is seen, too often, to have been but a pompous rhetorician, and the general without an army is but the tame hero of a market town. The greatness of Charles Strickland was authentic. It may be that you do not like his art, but at all events you can hardly refuse it the tribute of your interest. He disturbs and arrests. The time has passed when he was an object of ridicule, and it is no longer a mark of eccentricity to defend or of perversity to extol him. His faults are accepted as the necessary complement to his merits. It is still possible to discuss his place in art, and the adulation of his admirers is perhaps no less capricious than the disparagement of his detractors. But one thing can never be doubtful, and that is that he had genius. To my mind, the most interesting thing in art is the personality of the artist, and if that is singular, I am willing to excuse 1,000 faults. I suppose Velasquez was a better painter than El Greco, but custom stales one's admiration for him. The Cretan, sensual and tragic, proffers the mystery of his soul like a standing sacrifice. The artist, painter, poet, or musician, by his decoration, sublime or beautiful, satisfies the aesthetic sense, but that is akin to the sexual instinct and shares its barbarity. He lays before you also the greater gift of himself. To pursue his secret has something of the fascination of a detective story. It is a riddle which shares with the universe the merit of having no answer. The most insignificant of Strickland's works suggests a personality which is strange, tormented, and complex. And it is this, surely, which prevents even those who do not like his pictures from being indifferent to them. It is this which has excited so curious an interest in his life and character. It was not till 4 years after Strickland's death that Maurice Huet wrote the article in the Mercure de France which rescued the unknown painter from oblivion, and blazed the trail which succeeding writers, with more or less docility, have followed. For a long time, no critic has enjoyed in France a more incontestable authority, and it was impossible not to be impressed by the claims he made. They seemed extravagant, but later judgments have confirmed his estimate, and the reputation of Charles Strickland is now firmly established on the lines which he laid down. The rise of his reputation is one of the most romantic incidents in the history of art, but I do not propose to deal with Charles Strickland's work except in so far as it touches upon his character. I cannot agree with the painters who claim superciliously that the layman can understand nothing of painting, and that he can best show his appreciation of their works by silence and a checkbook. It is a grotesque misapprehension which sees in art no more than a craft comprehensible perfectly only to the craftsman. Art is a manifestation of emotion, and emotion speaks a language that all may understand. But I will allow that the critic who has not a practical knowledge of technique is seldom able to say anything on the subject of real value, and my ignorance of painting is extreme. Fortunately, there is no need for me to risk the adventure, since my friend Mr. Edward Leggett, an able as well as an admirable painter, has exhaustively discussed Charles Strickland's work in a little book, which is a charming example of a style, for the most part, less happily cultivated in England than in France. Maurice Huet, in his famous article, gave an outline of Charles Strickland's life, which was well calculated to whet the appetites of the inquiring. With his disinterested passion for art, he had a real desire to call the attention of the wise to a talent, which was in the highest degree original. But he was too good a journalist to be unaware that the human interest would enable him more easily to effect his purpose. And when such had come in contact with Strickland in the past, writers who had known him in London, painters who had met him in the cafes of Montmartre, discovered to their amazement that, where they had seen but an unsuccessful artist, like another, authentic genius had rubbed shoulders with them, there began to appear in the magazines of France and America a succession of articles, the reminiscences of one, the appreciation of another, which added to Strickland's notoriety, and fed without satisfying the curiosity of the public. The subject was grateful, and the industrious Whitebreck Rotholds, in his imposing monograph, has been able to give a remarkable list of authorities. The faculty for myth is innate in the human race. It seizes with avidity upon any incident surprising or mysterious in the career of those who have at all distinguished themselves from their fellows, and invents a legend to which it then attaches a fanatical belief. It is the protest of romance against the commonplace of life. The incidents of the legend become the hero's surest passport to immortality. The ironic philosopher reflects with a smile that Sir Walter Raleigh is more safely enshrined in the memory of mankind, because he set his cloak for the Virgin Queen to walk on than because he carried the English name to undiscovered countries. Charles Strickland lived obscurely. He made enemies rather than friends. It is not strange, then, that those who wrote of him should have eked out their scantly recollections with a lively fancy, and it is evident that there was enough in the little that was known of him to give opportunity to the romantic scribe. There was much in his life which was strange and terrible, in his character something outrageous, and in his fate not a little that was pathetic. In due course a legend arose of such circumstantiality that the wise historian would hesitate to attack it. But a wise historian is precisely what the Reverend Robert Strickland is not. He wrote his biography avowedly to remove certain misconceptions which had gained currency in regard to the later part of his father's life, and which had caused considerable pain to the persons still living. It is obvious that there was much in the commonly received account of Strickland's life to embarrass a respectable family. I have read this work with a good deal of amusement, and upon this I congratulate myself, since it is colourless and dull. Mr. Strickland has drawn the portrait of an excellent husband and father, a man of kindly temper, industrious habits and moral disposition. The modern clergyman has acquired in his study of the science which I believe is called the exegesis, an astonishing facility for explaining things away. But the subtlety with which the Reverend Robert Strickland has interpreted all the facts in his father's life, which a dutiful son might find it inconvenient to remember, must surely lead him in the fullness of time to the highest dignities of the Church. I see already his muscular calves encased in the gaiters episcopal. It was a hazardous, though maybe a gallant thing to do, since it is probable that the legend commonly received has no small share in the growth of Strickland's reputation, for there are many who have been attracted to his art by the detestation in which they held his character, or the compassion with which they regarded his death, and the son's well-meaning efforts threw a singular chill upon the father's admirers. It is due to no accident that when one of his most important works, The Woman of Samaria, was sold at Christie's shortly after the discussion which followed the publication of Mr. Strickland's biography, it fetched less than £235 less than it had done 9 months before, when it was bought by the distinguished collector whose sudden death had brought it once more under the hammer. Perhaps Charles Strickland's power and originality would scarcely have sufficed him to turn the scale, if the remarkable mythopoeic faculty of mankind had not brushed aside with impatience a story which disappointed all its craving for the extraordinary. And presently Dr. Weitbrecht Rotholz produced the work which finally set at rest the misgivings of all lovers of art. Dr. Weitbrecht Rotholz belongs to that school of historians which believes that human nature is not only as bad as it seems, but a great deal worse. And certainly the reader is safer of entertainment in their hands than in those of the writers who take a malicious pleasure in representing the great figures of romance as patterns of the domestic virtues. For my part, I should be sorry to think that there was nothing between Anthony and Cleopatra but an economic situation, and it will require a great deal more evidence than is ever likely to be available, thank God, to persuade me that Tiberius was a blameless monarch, as King George v. Dr. Weitbrecht Rotholz has dealt in such terms with the Reverend Robert Strickland's innocent biography, that it is difficult to avoid feeling a certain sympathy for the unlucky person. His decent reticence is branded as hypocrisy. His circumlocutions are roundly called lies, and his silence is vilified as treachery. And on the strength of peccadilloes, reprehensible in an author, but excusable in a son, the Anglo-Saxon race is accused of prudishness, humbug, pretentiousness, deceit, cunning, and bad cooking. Personally, I think it was rash of Mr. Strickland in refuting the account, which had gained belief of a certain unpleasantness between his father and mother, to state that Charles Strickland, in a letter written from Paris, had described her as an excellent woman, since Dr. Weitbrecht Rotholz was able to print the letter in facsimile, and it appears that the passage referred to ran in fact as follows: "God damn my wife, she is an excellent woman. I wish she was in hell." It is not thus that the Church in its great days dealt with evidence that was unwelcome. Dr. Weitbrecht Rotholz was an enthusiastic admirer of Charles Strickland, and there was no danger that he would whitewash him. He had an unerring eye for the despicable motive in actions that had all the appearance of innocence. He was a psychopathologist as well as a student of art, and the subconscious had few secrets from him. No mystic ever saw deeper meaning in common things. The mystic sees the ineffable, and the psychopathologist the unspeakable. There is a singular fascination in watching the eagerness with which the learned author ferrets out every circumstance which may throw discredit on his hero. His heart warms to him when he can bring forward some example of cruelty or meanness, and he exults like an inquisitor at the auto de fe of a heretic when, with some forgotten story, he can confound the filial piety of the Reverend Robert Strickland. Nothing has been too small to escape him, and you may be sure that if Charles Strickland left a laundry bill unpaid, it will be given you in extenso, and if he forbore to return a borrowed half-crown, no detail of the transaction will be omitted. Chapter 2. When so much has been written about Charles Strickland, it may seem unnecessary that I should write more. A painter's monument is his work. It is true I knew him more intimately than most. I met him first before ever he became a painter, and I saw him not infrequently during the difficult years he spent in Paris. But I do not suppose I should ever have set down my recollections if the hazards of the war had not taken me to Tahiti. There, as is notorious, he spent the last years of his life, and there I came across persons who were familiar with him. I find myself in a position to throw light on just that part of his tragic career which has remained most obscure. If they who believe in Strickland's greatness are right, the personal narratives of such as knew him in the flesh can hardly be superfluous. What would we not give for the reminiscences of someone who has been as intimately acquainted with El Greco as I was with Strickland? But I seek refuge in no such excuses. I forget who it was that recommended men for their soul's good to do each day 2 things they disliked. It was a wise man, and it is a precept that I have followed scrupulously. For every day I have got up and I have gone to bed. But there is in my nature a strain of asceticism, and I have subjected my flesh each week to a more severe mortification. I have never failed to read the literary supplement of the Times. It is a salutary discipline to consider the vast number of books that are written, the fair hopes which their authors see them published, and the fate which awaits them. What chance is there that any book will make its way among the multitude? And the successful books are but the successes of a season. Heaven knows what pains the author has been at, what bitter experiences he has endured, and what heartaches suffered, to give some chance reader a few hours' relaxation, or to while away the tedium of a journey. And if I may judge from the reviews, many of these books are well and carefully written. Much thought has gone to their composition. To some even has been given the anxious labour of a lifetime. The moral I draw is that the writer should seek his reward in the pleasure of his work, and in the release from the burden of his thought, and indifferent to aught else, care nothing for praise or censure, failure or success. Now the war has come, bringing with it a new attitude. Youth has turned to gods we of an earlier day knew not, and it is possible to see already the direction in which those who come after us will move. The younger generation, conscious of strength and tumultuous, have done with knocking at the door. They have burst in and seated themselves in our seats. The air is noisy with their shouts. Of their elders some, by imitating the antics of youth, strive to persuade themselves that their day is not over. They shout with the lustiest, but the war cry sounds hollow in their mouth. They are like poor wantons attempting with pencil, paint and powder, with shrill gaiety, to recover the illusion of their spring. The wiser go their way with a decent grace. In their chastened smile is an indulgent mockery. They remember that they too trod down a sated generation, with just clamour and with just scorn, and they foresee that these brave torch-bearers will presently yield their place also. There is no last word. The new evangel was old when Nineveh reared her greatness to the sky. These gallant words, which seem so novel to those that speak them, were said in accents scarcely changed 100 times before. The pendulum swings backwards and forwards. The circle is ever travelled anew. Sometimes a man survives a considerable time from an era, in which he had his place, into one which is strange to him, and then the curious are offered one of the most singular spectacles in the human comedy. Who now, for example, thinks of George Crabbe? He was a famous poet in his day, and the world recognized his genius with a unanimity which the greater complexity of modern life has rendered infrequent. He had learnt his craft at the school of Alexander Pope, and he wrote moral stories in rhymed couplets. Then came the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, and the poets sang new songs. Mr. Crabbe continued to write moral stories in rhymed couplets. I think he must have read the verse of these young men, who were making so great a stir in the world, and I fancy he found it poor stuff. Of course, much of it was, but the odes of Keats and of Wordsworth, a poem or two by Coleridge, a few more by Shelley, discovered vast realms of the spirit that none had explored before. Mr. Crabbe was as dead as mutton, but Mr. Crabbe continued to write moral stories in rhymed couplets. I have read desultorily the writings of the younger generation. It may be that among them a more fervid Keats, a more ethereal Shelley, has already published numbers the world will willingly remember. I cannot tell. I admire their polish. Their youth is already so accomplished that it seems absurd to speak of promise. I marvel at the felicity of their style, but with all their copiousness, they say nothing to me. To my mind, they know too much and feel too obviously. I cannot stomach the heartiness with which they slap me on the back, or the emotion with which they hurl themselves on my bosom. Their passion seems to me a little anemic, and their dreams a trifle dull. I do not like them. I am on the shelf. I will continue to write moral stories in rhymed couplets, but I should be thrice a fool if I did it for aught but for my own entertainment. But all this by the way, I was very young when I wrote my first book. By a lucky chance, it excited attention, and various persons sought my acquaintance. It is not without melancholy that I wander among my recollections of the world of letters in London when first, bashful but eager, I was introduced to it. It is long since I frequented it, and if the novels that describe its present singularities are accurate, much in it is now changed. The venue is different. Chelsea and Bloomsbury have taken the place of Hampstead, Notting Hill Gate and High Street, Kensington. Then it was a distinction to be under 40, but now to be more than 25 is absurd. I think in those days we were a little shy of our emotions, and the fear of ridicule tempered the more obvious forms of pretentiousness. I do not believe that there was in that genteel Bohemia an intensive culture of chastity, but I do not remember so crude a promiscuity as seems to be practiced in the present day. We do not think it hypocritical to draw over our vagaries the curtain of a decent silence. The spade was not invariably called a bloody shovel. Woman had not yet altogether come into her own. I lived near Victoria Station, and I recall long excursions by bus to the hospitable houses of the literary. In my timidity, I wandered up and down the street while I screwed up my courage to ring the bell, and then, sick with apprehension, was ushered into an airless room full of people. I was introduced to this celebrated person after that one, and the kind words they said about my book made me excessively uncomfortable. I felt they expected me to say clever things, and I never could think of any till after the party was over. I tried to conceal my embarrassment by handing round cups of tea and rather ill-cut bread and butter. I wanted no one to take notice of me, so that I could observe these famous creatures at my ease and listen to the clever things they said. I have a recollection of large, unbending women with great noses and rapacious eyes, who wore their clothes as though they were armour, and of little, mouse-like spinsters with soft voices and a shrewd glance. I never ceased to be fascinated by their persistence in eating buttered toast with their gloves on, and I observed with admiration the unconcern with which they wiped their fingers on their chair, when they thought no one was looking. It must have been bad for the furniture, but I suppose the hostess took her revenge on the furniture of her friends when in turn she visited them. Some of them were dressed fashionably, and they said they couldn't for the life of them see why you should be dowdy just because you had written a novel. If you had a neat figure, you might as well make the most of it, and a smart shoe on a small foot had never prevented an editor from taking your stuff. But others thought this frivolous, and they wore art fabrics and barbaric jewellery. The men were seldom eccentric in appearance. They tried to look as little as authors as possible. They wished to be taken for men of the world, and could have passed anywhere for the managing clerks of a city firm. They always seemed a little tired. I had never known writers before, and I found them very strange, but I do not think they ever seemed to me quite real. I remember that I thought their conversation brilliant, and I used to listen with astonishment to the stinging humour with which they would tear a brother author to pieces the moment that his back was turned. The artist has this advantage over the rest of the world, and his friends offer not only their appearance and their character to his satire, but also their work. I despaired over ever expressing myself with such aptness or with such fluency. In those days, conversation was still cultivated as an art. A neat repartee was more highly valued than the crackling of thorns under a pot, and the epigram, not yet a mechanical appliance by which the dull may achieve a semblance of wit, gave sprightliness to the small talk of the urbane. It is sad that I can remember nothing of this scintillation, but I think the conversation never settled down so comfortably as when it turned to the details of the trade, which was the other side of the art we practiced. When we had done discussing the merits of the latest book, it was natural to wonder how many copies had been sold, what advance the author had received, and how much he was likely to make out of it. Then we would speak of his publisher and of that, comparing the generosity of one with the meanness of another. We would argue whether it was better to go to one who gave handsome royalties, or to another who pushed a book for all it was worth. Some advertised badly, and some well. Some were modern, and some were old-fashioned. Then we would talk of agents and the offers they had obtained for us, of editors and the sort of contributions they welcomed, how much they paid 1,000, and whether they paid promptly or otherwise. To me it was all very romantic. It gave me an intimate sense of being a member of some mystic brotherhood. And that concludes tonight's readings. If you're not quite tired yet, you're always welcome to listen to another story. In the meantime, I'll be working on bringing you a new episode very soon. Until then, good night.